Hello, my name is Matthew, and I just finished reading Middlemarch by George Eliot, and I started reading this directly after reading and finishing the Karamazov Brothers by Dostoevsky, which was the most unlikely follow-up. One very long, serious, complex novel directly followed by another. And I love George Eliot. I've always found that I needed to be in a particular headspace, and for whatever reason, I started reading it. I did not read this beautiful format. I read it on my e-reader, but I carried on, and it's a marvel. I also couldn't escape all of the comparative thoughts from Middlemarch to the brothers Karamazov. Very, very different books that have odd similarities. They're both obscure, small towns, certain families, certain people that captivate the town. They're both very gossipy novels. The narrator in the Karamazov brothers switches styles, and it's not completely consistent, but very a large portion of the Karamazov brothers, the narrator is almost like the town voicing what's going on, and it's rumors and stories, and just we're hearing the town talk about what's going on. And in Middlemarch, the gossip is earned. So we have this omniscient narrator telling us about the lives of this of all the people that live in this town. You really feel like this sensation of a sprawling landscape of people that have lived real lives. This is a book about lives, and maybe several years in someone's life. And although it is a Victorian realistic novel, I do feel like Middlemarch subverts a lot of expectations. The characters are unlike so many of the characters that you meet in nearly any novel. What I mean by that is that they are all of the characters are thoughtful and considered, and you'll see so many times there will be an argument or a disagreement, and someone will make a pronouncement, and they'll go home or go into another room and think about the disagreement and come to a different conclusion, and return and apologize or acknowledge that they were being rash. It happens so much throughout this book. People being measured and thoughtful. We do have, of course, some main characters, which also really do subvert expectations. At the beginning, we meet Dorothea and her sister Cecilia. In private, Cecilia calls Dorothea Dodo, which is just an adorable, affectionate diminutive. And we think that we're going to be reading a love story or romance initially. Dorothea is independent and strong-willed. She has suitors. She has an uncle, Mr. Brooke, There's people that are interested in Dorothea that are good prospects, young, wealthy, well-reputed men. I'm thinking, of course, of Sir Chatham, Mr. Chatham. But Dorothea has different ideas. There's an elderly, seemingly wise and ponderous Mr. Casaubon who's working on this never-ending project, the history of all mythologies, and she believes that instead of young love, romance, all of the things that you might think about when you're young and having thoughts of marriage. Instead, she thinks to herself, well, I would rather marry a man that's older and wiser than me. I'll learn so much. I'll be a better person. And this horrifies everybody. You're not even marrying age yet, and instead of Sir Chatham, who is courting Dorothea, has interests that are aligned. Dorothea has this dream of creating a village for peasants to live in. Sir Chatham has the means to make that happen, and they start an alliance, and they do become cordial with one another. But in the end, Mr. Casaubon, the old, ponderous man, who is interested and makes a declaration of love and marriage to Dodo, she accepts. And Mr. Brooke, the uncle, has a conversation with Dorothea, trying to give some of his own wisdom. And he listens to his niece and accepts that she is going to make her own decisions in life. It's totally unlike what you would see in a novel. We have Mr. Brooke just listening and understanding, maybe certainly not agreeing, but understanding, like, this is your decision. And at this point, as you're reading the book, you might think, well, we're just going to carry on with the life of this family that we've met. Instead, it starts becoming more and more panoramic. It just starts widening. I mentioned these reasonable conversations, which is in stark contrast to that high-pitched, just full cranked up, ecstatic and electric dialogues that you find in the Karamazov brothers, where the characters are always at the height of any emotion. They are the most absolute and just at each other's throats at every second. And it's amazing how novels that are expounding on the human condition and what it means to be alive and what's important, how two great works, there's many great works, but the two that I've read can have just these amazingly different approaches to some of the same conclusions. George Eliot, even in this novel, mentions that these seemingly small, ordinary lives that you can find in any town, any village, any countryside, are full of parables that relate to any scale. You can learn so much. there's a wonderful thing that happens. Miss Brooke, Dorothea, Dodo, marries Mr. Casaubon, and they go on vacation. They go on their honeymoon. They go to Rome, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get into all the different characters, but there's Will Ladislaw, who hilariously is always getting confused as to whether he is Mr. Casaubon's nephew or cousin. There's several moments where that has to be clarified. But they go off to Rome, the newlywed couple, and we stay in Middlemarch. Middlemarch is the town. It's the town that we're in, and we have a visitor. We have a new resident, Doctor or Mister Doctor Lydgate, and he's from the big city. He's from London. Comes in, and he wants to start a practice. And I love that when they leave the town, we stay in the town, and we have this new person that arrives. And what ends up happening is he starts meeting these characters. He meets the local townspeople. He meets the banker. He meets Mr. Brooke, and he meets Sir Chatham and Caleb Garth, and these different characters that are important to the novel, but they're the people that live in the town. And very quickly, he becomes invested in these people, which is amazing for a reader. We're reading about there's a local election, or there might be a change in power at the hospital, and a cynical person might think, like, well, who cares? Who cares about the goings on of these random people? And we're introduced to this, and we're sucked in with the way that we find Dr. Lydgate caring about these people. And Mr. Casaubon's story is tragic. He's working on this grand work. It turns out that years and years, maybe decades, he's been working on it, but he hasn't actually started writing the book. He's still in the preparatory stage, and Dorothea, in Rome, while Mr. Casaubon spends his entire time not on his honeymoon properly, but in these ancient Roman libraries and churches, furthering his studies, she spends time with this cousin nephew, Ladislaw, and they have a connection. She feels like she has someone to speak to, and she doesn't really know how important that connection will be. They get back to Middlemarch, just a provincial town in England. Ladislaw shows up. He's supposed to be abroad. He's supposed to be in Germany. He wasn't even supposed to be in Rome. And this increasingly irks Mr. Casaubon. Things happen, but he becomes ill. He's going to die. The new doctor is there, tending to the patient, Mr. Casaubon, and consoling Dorothea. When he dies, the will comes out that she inherits this great fortune on the stipulation that she never marries Ladislaw, which it runs a shock through the family, because there's this implication that perhaps she had been untrue to her husband, which she hadn't. She was a devoted wife. Turns out disillusioned and unhappy, but she was loyal. Now, Mr. Lydgate, Dr. Lydgate, who's the in my mind, the character that introduced us to the broader picture of the town. Because we learn about the schools and the hospitals and the banks and the stores and all of the characters that are there, um, that are just percolating throughout the book. He ends up marrying the most beautiful girl in town. He marries Rosamond, and practically everybody agrees Rosamond is just the most beautiful, and there was no one that was worth her beauty in town. And at first, you might start thinking, okay, well, we had a bit of a tragic story with Dorothea, who's now 21 and already widowed, went through this unfortunate marriage, which wasn't what she had imagined. But we have a young, prosperous doctor who comes into town, and we're following him. And it feels like here we are. Here's going to be a hero or a protagonist. Um, he's a doctor. He's maybe abrupt and can be curt to people. He has disagreements with other decisions or practices that the other doctors in the town have, but he's someone that we can follow and get along. And he has just one of the most tragic stories. We just watch his dreams fall apart, his life go to pieces, with all of these interconnected components of all these different people having decisions that come together. We see this several times with other characters. There was it Fred Vinci? It's a whole totally other storyline which I can't get into, but he's like completely in debt and had a whole education and kind of blew it all, making all these bad decisions. And someone or other dies. I can't remember. Maybe it was Casabom or someone else. And there were two wills, and the first will is read, and he gets this fortune. The second will is read, and he gets nothing. It's a whole other thing. But Dr. Lydgate hooked up with this banker. They Bulstrode, and they are gonna start this new hospital. And we hear about the wider world. News from London is coming in. News of cholera throughout Europe. We're reading the news just as any small town person would hear about what the big stories are in the world. There's talk of reform of England. But anyway, he gets himself over his head in debt by trying to provide the life that Rosamond is accustomed to. She comes from a fairly wealthy family, and they have a certain lifestyle that they have, certain size houses, and a certain amount of servants and carriages, and they throw parties and have dinners. But his profession isn't bringing in the income to counterbalance his expenses. And he brings this up to his wife, who just doesn't understand. Just says, well, why don't you just go ask someone for the £1,000 that you need? Why don't you ask the family? And she even writes to Dr. Lydgate's, I can't remember, but a relative, and says, "Oh, can you send us $1,000 for this?" And we find that she is just so obstinate to the reality that they're in, and sabotaging what Dr. Lydgate is trying to not have them go into ruin. He finally has to go to some sort of debt collector that can hold securities on possessions, and the embarrassing financial actions to try to save his marriage. Now, Mr. Bulstrode, the banker, he we find that this new character, his name was, God, I just read it, I can't remember. It's like Razzles or Rascal or Raffles. This new character comes into town who is from Mr. Bulstrode's past. And it turns out that Mr. Bulstrode has a scandalous past with this big secret that would entirely ruin him. Well, he pays him off and then sends him on his way saying, "Don't you ever come back." On his way out of town, he falls ill. Now, Dr. Lydgate had gone to Mr. Bulstrode asking for the $1,000, and he's rebuked. He says, "No, you have to stand on your own feet." This is after multiple attempts of Lydgate cowering before several people going through the same motions. So there's a turn of events. We have now someone that has a secret that could ruin the banker. He goes back to Lydgate, wants him to treat him as a patient, and now, just coincidentally, wants to offer him the $1,000. There's a very unfortunate night. The patient dies, which momentarily could be a bit of a relief to Mr. Bulstrode. But it turns out he had talked before he died, not to Lydgate. And the gossip that starts happening is so well earned. The women are talking, the men on corners are talking, and we're hearing all of these people talk about. Now we have the situation where Lydgate, who's now known to be in financial ruin, was also apparently, from appearances, paid off by the banker to mistreat this person that came into town that had a secret that would ruin the banker. And whether or not it's true, Lydgate's reputation is now just completely in ruins. So we just had this like downfall of a character. Now, all the while, Ladislaw and Dorothea have had a very distant longing for one another. They were always true, or Dorothea was always true, and has become wiser and more obstinate. So that being said, she has a fortune. She's the only person in town that believes the doctor, Lydgate, was true and good. Says, only shallow-minded people would believe this gossip that we're greedily gobbling up. And she wants to offer to fund Dr. Lydgate to keep the hospital that the banker, who's now also in ruins and defamed, he has to get out of the picture. She'll fund it. He'll be able to regain his reputation, have a practice through her goodwill as a benefactor. So she goes over to hand a check. She walks in the room, and there's Rosamond, the most beautiful girl, and Ladislaw embracing. They're holding hands, and a shock runs through the room. Dorothea leaves. All of a sudden, there's a news scandal. And again, Dorothea goes home, thinks about it, and she's not rash. Uh, decides she's going to go back over, have the meeting that she wanted to have, and work through this. There's a private walk with Rosamond and Dorothea where it's revealed that that embrace was actually Ladislaw, who's ruined and has his own reputation in turmoil for lots of reasons. He was confiding in Rosamond that he couldn't love anybody other than Dorothea. And he was showing his heart to somebody, and it just came off as a bad look. In the same way that the night with the patient dying, from an outside perspective, comes off as a bad look. There's happy endings, there's tragic endings. Throughout this, we have George Eliot in the minds and hearts and actions of these characters, showing us like just how important these lives are. At this point, after going through the Karamazov brothers right into Middlemarch, I have no idea what I'm going to be reading next. If you have recommendations, I would be happy for them. Let me know if you've read the book. Let me know your thoughts. Of course, it's one of the great books. So thank you for watching. Please leave a comment if you would like. Thank you, and take care.